Howdy, various partners. Let's talk about freedom, yeah?
Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose.
That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Figuring things out for yourself is the only freedom anyone really has. Use that freedom. Make up your own mind, Rico.
What you represent to them is freedom.
What the hell's wrong with freedom, man? That's what it's all about.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's what it's all about, all right. But talking about it and being it, that's two different things. I mean, it's real hard to be free when you are bought and sold in the marketplace. Of course, don't ever tell anybody that they're not free, because then they're going to get real busy killing and maiming to prove to you that they are.
Freedom is a word that gets tossed around like a hot stone at the hand-burning exposition. Of all the philosophical concepts that can be summed up in one word, freedom is both the most ambiguous and most loaded. I don't think there is another word that evokes such a powerful response in all peoples, while meaning something different to each of them. To those enslaved, freedom means escaping literal bondage and joining the rest of society as their own master. To those not encumbered by physical chains and direct violence, freedom might mean the ability to simply pursue their desires in life without the oversight of a government or other overwhelming force, or at least not one they don't have control over. To travelers, freedom means having no ties to any one location, the ability to leave as you please without any guilt of conscience. Maybe for some of you, it means reaching a point where you are not financially struggling. To others, maybe it means escaping your anxieties or feeling comfortable in your own skin. There is a reason for this, of course. Whatever heights we've reached in civilization and technology, whichever path we find ourselves on in our personal lives, we always find something new encumbering us from both our tiniest hopes and our most burning desires. A new barrier, barring us from whatever we find ourselves wanting for. In our minds, just beyond that barrier, that's what freedom is. However, that barrier is different for all of us. I personally feel that no matter what freedom means for you, it's not really freedom unless everyone gets it. True, unencumbered freedom cannot exist unless it is a reality for everyone, right? Well, in this video, we're going to discuss what and why that is. Why is freedom intrinsically tied to responsibility? Where does your freedom end and mine begin? Does the freedom to do whatever you want supersede your freedom from the whims of the world's madmen? Where do the invisible ties that bind you lead? I'm Jourdain, and this is See for Yourself. In most places, but especially in the US, when we think of freedom, we usually think of rights. Those things we will always be allowed to do because our Constitution prohibits the federal government from making laws against them. These are the big dogs, especially those in the First Amendment. We're talking freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition the government for change. When folks talk about their rights, when they talk about freedom in this socio-political context, that's my cat, they are usually referring to the things listed in the First or Second Amendment of the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment, of course, being the freedom to form a well-regulated militia and the freedom of the people to bear arms. Now, I'm not here to interpret what the Constitution says, just to talk about the ideas of freedom that document might evoke. Said document does go on to list more rights. Freedom from soldiers randomly sleeping in your house, freedom against unreasonable searches and seizures, etc. Go read it for yourself. The interesting thing, I think, about this Constitution is the way most people perceive its effect on them. See, a lot of folks talk about the Constitution giving them the unalienable right to do something. That's not really the case, though. The document isn't there to grant you an ability, but rather to grant you a protection. All of the language is there to make it illegal for the federal government to stop you from doing something. The First Amendment doesn't start, this document hereby grants these rights. It starts by saying, Congress shall make no law, prohibiting. It's not there to necessarily give you the right to say whatever you want or practice whatever religion or own a gun. It's there to stop the government from taking those rights away, theoretically at least. In practice or not, these are not freedoms to something, they are freedoms from something. I find this whole concept pretty interesting. Presupposing that a document can grant, repeal, protect, create, or erase true freedom anyway, it is intriguing the way we interpret our rights, the way we categorize them, place some on a higher tier, the lengths we will go to ensure their apparent survival, which ones we choose to trample, and who they should belong to. Truth be told, I don't think rights have much to do with freedom anyway. Rights are just legal jargon relating to which actions are and are not considered crimes. When the Constitution, a document of the government, says the government can't stop you from doing this, it's effectively saying, here's what we will allow you to do. If a person or a document must allow it first, is that really a freedom? If the right can be extinguished and the only thing stopping that from happening is a piece of paper, how much of a right is that? When I was 13, we took the much-hyped annual 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. Now this was only 2 short years after a little something called 9/11, so security was still through the roof and we didn't really get to see all of the Capitol. What I do remember seeing, however, was a bunch of war memorials, namely the Korean War Memorial, which notably reads, "Freedom is not free." I remember reading that in 8th grade and being like, what the hell does that even mean? Freedom isn't free. Of course I knew what it implied, that we only had our American freedoms because of the sacrifices of military personnel who fought against those that might take those freedoms away. Not exactly fitting for a memorial representing the Korean War specifically, in my opinion, but that's not the point. I thought to myself, if freedom cost something, is that still freedom? If you have to supposedly fight constantly to maintain freedom, what kind of freedom is that? It seems to me that the freedom we most often speak of isn't so much a freedom in and of itself, but a protection from a freedom-threatening outside force. This is a crucial concept in our understanding of freedom, the idea that for it to be fully expressed, fully realized, it must be guarded from anything that may disrupt it. Again, not a freedom to, but a freedom from. Largely, we've only been discussing freedom as it relates to society as a whole, politics, and laws. And though this context does play at least a minor role in all definitions of freedom, it isn't the only thing that comes to mind when the word is spoken. Let's talk about freedom in a broader sense, then we can loop back around and see how everything ties together. Imagine with me, if you will, a world of absolute, uncontestable, true freedom. As hard as this might be to imagine, whatever contradictions or questions might arise in your mind, just try to follow me down this line. In this world, there are no laws, no nations, no leaders or armies. No one to grant or deny your rights, and no one to stop others from doing so. Still here in this quasi-paradise, let's say your rights don't need protecting. Your freedom doesn't have a cost. Everyone somehow just agrees. We all have the right to do as we please, up until that right infringes on other abilities to do so. Obviously, an agreement like this, however unrealistic it may seem, is only a prohibition of the self, meaning it only works if you simply stop yourself from doing anything that may hurt another person and their freedom. Again, there are no laws, no law enforcement, no one other than yourself to stop you from trampling on the rights of another. Basically, the only rule here is the golden rule. Treat others how you would want to be treated. This solves violence, right? Theft, manipulation, dereliction, exploitation. But again, we're imagining here. In this world, it works. In this world, the only barrier to your freedom is your own imagination. Except, even in this fictional realm, it's not. The laws of nature still apply. Time and entropy still apply. Death still exists. You are not free to fly amongst the birds, nor free to live as long as you please. Civilizations and legal documents aside, there are still prohibitions. Though you will never be forced to labor, or pay taxes, or be stopped from crossing borders, or be bound from your ambitions, there will still be forces holding you back from your deepest desires. Unless this utopia also has sci-fi levels of futuristic technologies, your freedom may still be limited by gravity, friction, self-doubt, and time. Bearing this hypothetical scenario in mind, what exactly is freedom anyway? Is it the ability to do whatever we can imagine, provided we aren't stopping others from doing the same? Is it the state of having no physical barriers or chains, a sense of being unburdened by the drudgery of life, the opinions of others, or your own emotions? Is freedom granted? Is it given out, metered, balanced? Does it only work if we limit it? Or is it unbridled, arriving with us at our birth? Can we touch it, or at least touch the thing that is keeping us from it? To those who live within the confines of obvious, physical, observable oppression, freedom is often the mere ability to exist in the wider society as the unoppressed do, even if that larger society isn't exactly free. When enslaved people in the American South were set free, as it were, they were merely pushed into the society that allowed for their enslavement in the first place. I don't think you need the history lesson of just how unfree these individuals were in this society either, even without their chains. But I'm left to wonder, and forgive me if it's out of turn, is simply joining American society what those individuals were thinking of when they dreamed of freedom? Or this: every once in a while an inmate escapes from prison. As a matter of fact, it happened twice at the facility I was in while I was there. Anyway, I was always thinking the same thing when it happens. They are never really escaping to freedom. They are simply shedding one confine for another. After all, it's not as if these individuals can just live their normal lives again, rejoin their families, settle down. Law enforcement will always be looking for them. Anything they do, they must do while watching over their shoulders. Obviously, they might escape to a foreign country and go largely unnoticed, achieving a sort of freedom, but they aren't free to return home, to use their own name. A lot of our freedoms are like this. It's not that we are ever granted new abilities, just that we're given lighter chains. And I know what some of you are thinking too, by the way, that there have to be some sort of boundaries, some sort of authority to protect our freedoms, even if from said authority. That for civilized society to work, even with a golden rule, there have to be obligations. People have to do things that limit their freedom, like doing the jobs that keep society going, building things, finding and appropriating resources. For all of us to get the most out of life, we need to do more than just agree on a few ground rules. We have to have entities that constantly fight to make sure our society is free and civilized, right? Well, that's where I disagree. I don't think using our finite time to make society work actually limits freedom. I think the combined efforts of humanity are to give us more freedom, or at least more free time. Even in our fictional anarchist paradise, people would still have to have a job of sort. It is one of those natural limitations. Do we need governments, laws, and militaries to make that work, though? Of that, I can admit, I'm not certain. To govern, to deem legal or illegal, to fight or defend, all of that implies a force that limits our freedoms too, while offering us freedom from. My issue with freedom as it is now is that it has to be both for it to actually work. You don't have the freedom to say whatever you want, practice your chosen faith, or own a weapon if you don't have the freedom from oppression, prohibition, and violence. And it's not just governments and institutions that trample on our freedoms. We are often doing it to each other as well. Let's keep it simple here. You are exercising your freedom to walk unencumbered down the street. However, from the moment you leave your house, I'm right there in your face, screaming maniacally at you. Maybe I'm calling you an abomination, telling you I hate you, or just making fun of your shoes. Doesn't matter. Your freedom to be at peace while walking down the street is now being trampled upon. However, don't I have the right to say whatever I want to whoever I want in a public space? After all, I'm not touching you. I'm not physically stopping you from walking, from exercising your rights. If you stop me from hurling insults at you, are you now trampling on my freedom? In our current system, an outside entity must decide which freedom is more important in this situation. Obviously, something like this can't carry on for either of us. So a court, a judge, must grant a ruling. Are you more free to walk peacefully than I am to yell in your face? I think most of us, being in the position to judge this particular case, would find it easy. Of course, it is my freedom that should be restricted here. After all, you are using your freedom peacefully. And while the way I'm using mine isn't necessarily violent, it is a bit disruptive. Unless you really like to debate legal theory, I think this is a pretty easy to judge case. There are harassment laws in place that already restrict people from this sort of behavior, at least in many instances. Harassment laws and others like them are sort of our traditional golden rule policies, if you will. Your fundamental codes, both legal and moral, that show up cross-culturally and over different periods of time. Don't murder, don't steal, and don't do anything toward a person that is against their wishes. Nothing that you wouldn't, have done unto you. Although laws, municipal codes, treaties, and other governing documents can get quite confusing, the supposed basis of most fall within this theme. They are there to protect our freedoms, not from the government itself, but from each other. So while documents like the Constitution limit the powers of the government against the people, most laws limit the power of the people against each other. For the most part, I agree with the basic ideas behind these documents and regulations as well. I agree with the golden rule, and I'm sure that's not controversial to say, at least it shouldn't be. And taking a leap of faith here, I think most people do too. The majority of folks can agree that we shouldn't have the wide open ability to hurt each other for our own gain, nor should our governments. Collectively, we have sort of agreed to give up certain aspects of freedom for others. Throughout the reaches of time, generations have built civilizations spanning the globe, all of them with some similar agreements. And though many of these agreements did not grant freedom nor protection to all, they needed something to hold the cracks together, the freedoms we willingly give away, in hopes that they hold civilization together long enough that a better freedom might be found. And listen, save for a certain breed of ultra-edgy dipshit nerds, none of us want to go back to being wild beast. Though that is more of a pure form of freedom, living briefly and carnally as another animal of Earth, I think most of us hope for something better. We understand as a species that not every boundary is a confine. Sometimes the wall you hit might actually be a step up. At some point in history, we decided that living together in large groups was worth doing. I can't imagine that organizing large-scale operations to feed and house huge groups of people was any easier then than it is now. But they did it for a reason. As a natural consequence, they started to develop rules to help them live better in the same space. I don't know if these ancient people knew that what they were doing was willingly giving up freedoms in exchange for others, but in any case, I don't think they would have cared. People have to have understood to some extent that they were building toward something greater. It could have just been the connection, the empathy, the oxytocin, the excitement and fun that comes from being around other people that drove them. They may have just wanted to have more people together at once for the sake of it, or the value of a large workforce. However, that happening consistently with varying rules and levels of freedom got us to where we are now, in a new society, another civilization, and though it has cost us some freedoms along the way, it has also given us a few new ones. Thanks to modern technology, you can travel more of the world faster in a lifetime than anyone has ever been able to. Thanks to modern medicine, you might live long enough to do so. And hey, if travel isn't your thing, you can still video chat with someone from the other side of the globe. If you're lucky, and you pace yourselves, you can pack more experiences into your life than anyone before modern times would have been able to. The shedding of certain freedoms, the agreements made by societies past and present, have granted us freedoms we did not have before. There has been a trade-off of sorts. This hasn't worked perfectly, of course, and not everyone will always agree to the same rules. Otherwise, we wouldn't need these laws nor regulations, nor the jails and prisons that come with them, would we? But let's talk about these sort of freedom trades on a more micro level. Say you are on a diet. Restricting yourself from foods you want to eat in exchange for a healthier body is, in fact, a trade of freedoms, only a self-imposed one. You have made an arrangement with yourself to forgo your freedom to indulge in whatever meal you please, and in exchange you will have the freedom to live a more active lifestyle or whatever your reason for losing weight might be. We don't even need the diet analogy to explain this really. Most adults are already making these sorts of deals with themselves every day. We don't eat ice cream before bed because we don't want our tummies to hurt. We don't rail lines at Denny's because we don't want to become addicted. We don't park our car in our neighbor's driveway because we simply don't want them parking in ours. We individually give up freedoms to do certain things in exchange for freedoms from their consequences. This is just a small-scale version of that hypothetical super-free utopia we were talking about earlier. In that world, these little agreements with ourselves are the law. We wouldn't need to have these agreements society-wide as long as we had them with the person we're most accountable to. In theory, at least. Truth be told, though, it is a lot easier for most of us, myself included, to imagine the consequences our actions have on ourselves than it is to imagine the consequences our actions might have on others. So that utopia stays hypothetical, for now. Is freedom a trade, then? A balancing of actions and consequences? Must we always give up the freedom to an action to receive the freedom from its consequences? Do we require a large governing force to decide which trades we will all make? Does any of this get us any closer to actually understanding what freedom is, how it works, or what it feels like? Maybe we can better understand freedom if we first explore some of the things that keep us from it. Bondage, slavery, the anchoring, the tethers that keep us securely fixed to this place, this time, and this reality. The boundaries that keep us from new freedoms. Outside of literal chains or prison walls, most of the things that keep us from freedom are intangible. Laws, trauma, poverty, ideas really, thoughts made up in our heads or more likely the heads of others, laws written or unwritten that hold us just as securely as actual ropes. Think about the things you want for currently, to pay the rent, to get a new car, to be rich, to find a partner. What are the chains keeping you from these new freedoms? Are they physical? Can you pick up the key to them? Or does it require something more, a better job, more confidence, a healthy ego, maybe more free time, a little room to breathe? Sometimes these restrictions pile up and there isn't one simple route to freedom. Maybe you break your chains and run, but you find a fence blocking your path. And we're not talking about a self-imposed fence. We're talking about a barrier someone else has erected. And whether or not it was meant for you, it is still blocking your way. I'm sure some of you are picking up on what I'm trying to say here. Since I can only speak for myself, though, I'll use a personal example. Because of my experience with addiction and its consequences, I was able to gain a little bit of insight into what it's like to have your freedoms taken away, both physically and mentally. During addiction itself, I lost a good deal of control over my own desires and will. Anyone with similar experiences can tell you, anything that you might want takes a back seat to the will of the addiction. Though some would say that this is a phenomenon brought on by lack of self-control, I can firmly say that that's nonsense and they can get bent. Regardless, during active addiction, you develop a near alter ego that represents the substance craving part of your brain. When that part of you is in control, you are no longer free. In addition to the mental and emotional bondage, I also landed myself in actual prison, which is about as unfree as you could possibly be. I was blocked from my desires not only by this mental parasite controlling my thoughts and compulsions, but by physical walls and fences, guards, and the Department of Corrections. Through this whole period of my life, not only was I not free, but I wasn't even me. Through loss of freedoms, I started to lose my sense of self, my interest, my desires, and dreams. When I got out of prison after a year, roughly 9 months sober, and on parole, I was in a weird, ethereal state of being when it came to freedom. I still felt massively restricted by my future relationship with the DOC on parole, the addiction I was barely detached from, and this massive hill I knew was in front of me if I ever wanted to rebuild my life. However, at the same time, I sort of felt like a blank slate. I felt like my job experience didn't matter, my former hobbies and interests didn't matter. I was completely free to become whoever I wanted to be, at least on a personal level. Many of my old hobbies, interests, and aspirations did in fact make a reappearance later, but that's not the point. On the one hand, I was confident I could begin to rebuild my personality and spirit into something I wanted to be. On the other, I had 9 months of parole with job and meeting requirements, a couple of grand in fines, no car, a suspended license, and a custody battle stopping me from even beginning to get started on any kind of a 5 or 10 year plan. I couldn't vote. I didn't know anyone who could or would help me get a job. All of my possessions were in a single garbage bag. I had exactly $0. I wasn't allowed to leave the state without asking. These were the chains keeping me from any kind of freedom. Today, admittedly, most of those restrictions are gone. I have a mostly sublime life, and I don't feel bound by aspects of my own personality or my addictions. However, I'm still not completely free. I work an hourly wage job at a factory, and I've got bills to pay. If I want to afford myself some free time, some breathing room, I have to put in 20 times as much time and effort into working for someone else. And this is where the boundaries stop being unique to me. Unless you are already wealthy, if you do not participate in the workforce and undertake bills and responsibilities, you will lose whatever small bit of freedom you buy with those burdens. We know the consequences of deviating from this. Homelessness or incarceration. Is that freedom? Some would say this is the actual balance of freedom, responsibility. And I don't disagree with this as a concept. To balance the freedom to with the freedom from, we absolutely need responsibility. That responsibility is the foundation for the arrangements of society. This isn't exactly what we agreed upon, though. And if this is the route we are taking, what we agreed upon was shouldering the responsibilities of the freedoms we have chosen to indulge in, and that we've been allowed to choose, of course. What we have instead is a society where those of the lowest caste shoulder the responsibilities of the freedom enjoyed by those in the highest. This is not freedom. It is theft, and it is inherently antithetical to the idea of freedom itself. It is my sincere belief, again, that no one has experienced true freedom unless it was a freedom that could be had by everyone. It is one thing to trade and barter freedoms and responsibilities with ourselves for both our own good and the good of our communities, but it is another to force this commerce onto an unwilling or unwitting population, to give them new responsibilities and shake them down for their freedoms. Alright, I know I'm probably rambling here and it's not making any sense. What I'm saying is this: freedom is free, and we ain't fucking free, bud. Though most of us tell ourselves we're already living in the freest version of society, and when anyone suggests that we aren't, we can't even comprehend it. But there is no civilization-wide desire to achieve more freedom, and there's certainly no national desire. We are either content with what we have, or we're stuck on the idea that to get any more freedom, we're going to have to subjugate somebody. We want all of the rights, none of the responsibilities, baby. And I'm not saying like, grr, nobody wants to work anymore. Boop, boop, beep, beep. Quite the opposite, bubby. I'm saying most people do the damned work already, and it's time to give them what they've earned. Not that freedom is even something you should have to earn. I just mean that we have reached a level as a planet, technologically, economically, medically, and socially, that we could offer a better, truer freedom to all, but we choose not to. Complete, unrestricted, no consequence freedom can only exist in our dreams. We can create a better version of one in reality, though. Some of it will be about balance, trades, agreements, responsibilities, but a lot of it is already there, paid for, just waiting for the gates to be opened so that we can walk through. I know this particular video has had a lot of vague, floaty language, and I do apologize. It's just hard to define freedom when I don't think a practical example of it has ever existed to point to. While you could say that the nomadic bands of hunter-gatherer tribes of long past were free, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree, to envision life reverting back to that in order to achieve freedom is juvenile. The key to the chains exists in the here and now. Things change, and so the meaning of freedom changes with it. Some things will always hold us back, right? Time, death, the limits of our own understanding, the forces of nature, and the laws of physics. However, the most pressing restrictions are usually thrust upon us by others, and they must constantly be chipped away at until they can be broken entirely. I want to be able to take an extra day of rest when I know I need it without fear of losing my job. I want going to the damn doctor to feel worth it. That's not an insane ask, right? I mean, getting help when you're sick or injured should be worth it on principle alone, but I know some of y'all will understand when I say, sometimes it's just not. How free am I when sometimes it's worth more to suffer? How free is anyone? Honestly, freedom is just an idea anyway. It's something we have to always be reaching for, or it will kind of stop existing. Things have to keep getting better. Stagnation causes new boundaries to crop up. Reversion causes entries and exits to disappear. It's not progress for the sake of progress, or freedom for the sake of freedom. It's doing our best with what we have, and just always asking if what we have is the best we can do. Sometimes, freedom can be thought of as whatever exists just beyond the wall that's surrounding a city. If you have no desire to leave the confines of the city, you might feel completely free inside of its walls, living out your every whim within its city streets. If you do have a desire to leave, though, these same walls now hold you prisoner. Freedom cannot exist inside of them. It is something you must go beyond the wall to find. A lot of people have no intention of ever leaving the city. In fact, most don't even know there is anything other than the city at all. There can be no wall because there is nothing beyond it. And there is nothing beyond the wall because the wall doesn't exist. Some may want to leave, but they are told that any possible land beyond must be inhabited by monsters. There are so many metaphors for freedom and oppression because the words can mean so many different things to different people at various points in history. The idea of it is different in every time and place, something that could only be conceived of there and then. If the best things in life are free, but freedom isn't free, is freedom not that good? What if freedom cost $1? That would almost be as good of a deal as you would get over on my Patreon. Buddy, I tell you what, hi, howdy, how are you, how you been? Now, I would never waste a minute of your time, and you can bet a barrel of nickels I wouldn't waste a single second of my own. So listen, I heard you was looking for a reputable place wherein you might be able to spend $1 a month. Well, check dig, little puppy dog, because here's what you're going to want to do. Head on over to patreon.com/Jourdain Edmondson, and if you'll just tightly grip those little reins and hold them horses of yours, I'm fixing to tell you why, okay? Number one, you're going to get early access to every video on this channel. That means if you're already a patron, you're seeing this video before anyone else. Now, ain't that something? But it ain't the only thing, because number two, you're going to get exclusive access to my podcast, The Obscure Curio. Now, we're back after a brief hiatus, and though they hate us because they ain't us, we're still getting heinous in that anus, baby. We're doing an episode every week, and 95% of them can be found nowhere but Patreon. And three, we will throw that beautiful little string of alphabetic characters you call a name up in the credits of every video. Stick around to the credits in this video to see the saints among sinners and kings amongst men that are already supporting old Peepaw in all of his endeavors. Now again, patreon.com/Jourdain Edmondson, where for less than a price of a cup of coffee, you can support my caffeine addiction while gaining early video access, exclusive podcast access, patron recognition, and much, much more. Who knows? Maybe I'll mail a live groundhog to your house. Now go on back to the video, little scamp. Alright, so where does that leave us? Pretty much right back where we started, right? Unable to define freedom concretely, to point to an example of it, or reach the things keeping us from it. But we still know it's there. We experience flashes of it, like a short, sweet aroma of wildflower floating by briefly on the wind. I feel like I said everything I wanted to in this video, but just in case, let's reiterate the main points. Freedom is an idea. Only beta versions of it can ever exist. As soon as we decide we have reached full freedom, we are immediately burdened with the limits of our understanding and imagination. We have to constantly be dreaming up newer, unburdened versions of ourselves and our world, and then striving after them. However, we must also remember to always balance these freedoms with the correct responsibilities, and to make sure those responsibilities fall on the right shoulders, baby. We cannot have absolute freedom to do whatever we please if we do not have freedom from violence, oppression, and the like. If this is done right, everyone will enjoy in the same rights and responsibilities. If it doesn't work that way, we haven't become free just yet. Freedom is free. It is inherent and it is emergent. It's a feature of life. Other people, whether individual or grouped together in a government, agency, corporation, or militia, can only prohibit your freedoms. They can play a role in protecting them, but they can never grant them. If we are to have these sort of civilization-wide agreements, we must understand that, as a species, Just because we aren't completely free yet doesn't mean those small tastes of freedom aren't worth indulging in, though. Listening to music, skateboarding, mountain biking, traveling, dancing, whatever it is in life that lifts even one link from the chain is worth doing. Any burden that we can lift from ourselves now only gets us that much closer to true freedom. This was just sort of my attempt at expressing some ideas in the best way I could come up with. This video didn't have any research, science, or statistics to back up any of its points. I'm just using this form of expression to help myself understand what it is that I'm after. But if it didn't do anything for you personally, that's okay. You can just turn off the video, go jump your own wall, and see for yourself.